Good morning and welcome once again to Live with Lewis for the 17th of June 2004. We're broadcasting to you live today from Lexington, Missouri on the high hills above the Missouri River. We're just about 40 minutes drive from Kansas City, Kansas, and we're happy to have you all with us again as we make our way west. Once again, I'd like to remind all of you in our internet audience today that you can send us questions at any time throughout today's broadcast at lewisandclark.k12.mo.us. Excuse me, that's lewisandclark@clayton.k12.mo.us. And we look forward to your questions and comments, and we'll be taking those a little bit later in today's broadcast. As always, we'll start today's broadcast by reviewing what happened to the original expedition 200 years ago over the past week since we've seen you last. You may remember our last broadcast came to you from Glasgow, Missouri, and since that time we've been making our way up the river past a number of points of interest from the original expedition. The geographic nature of the area we're moving through here changes fundamentally. The high bluffs have started to give way to open prairies and rolling hills, and much like the original expedition, we have been able to observe this dramatic change in landscape as we have moved into truly a more western terrain. Some of the points of interest from this past week, as far as the journals are concerned from 200 years ago, is the river itself. The river, since we saw you last, has really become the key and focal character in the story once again. We have passed, since we left the Glasgow area, we have passed the Chariton, the Little Chariton and the Chariton rivers, and the Grand River when we made our way up to Brunswick, and we'll be seeing some footage of that a little bit later, past the Grand River. And then as we moved on up to the area we're in today, here near Waverly, passing by Lexington, Missouri, we passed a number of extremely rapid waters. The waters today, of course, are very different than those of 200 years ago, but despite the change in the channelization by the Corps of Engineers and those sorts of things, this particular stretch of river continues to be a somewhat treacherous one with high currents, and the river really does dictate the way we move on the river, as it did for the Corps 200 years ago. 200 years ago, Clark remarks about the problems that they had maneuvering past the vicinity that we have just passed, and refers to it as the most troublesome and difficult portion of the Missouri River, and that, of course, had been communicated to him in large part by the French boatmen who were moving along with them. From a historical perspective, they are passing places such as Wakanda Creek, which when George Drouillard was out hunting, reports back to the captains that he has heard the sound of a large snake at a pond about 5 miles south of the river, and the snake makes a sound like a turkey gobbler. Now, there's no evidence that such a snake exists, and that story seems to be rooted in Native American folklore. We also know that at this point they're still taking bears on a regular basis. They're beginning to see buffalo along this stretch of the river as well, and deer remain plentiful. They record in the journals that there are elk here, but we know that that was really not a correct statement, that they had not identified any elk at this particular point. Probably some large deer perhaps had been spotted, and that may have been the cause for that. They also, at this particular point along the river, are starting to see evidence of Native American villages as they move along, abandoned ones, and they start to record some of the anthropological information that will become so useful down the road, including some of the dynamics of the native tribes of the Missouri. For example, the Missouri Oto and some of the other tribes had been warring, the Pawnee, and they remark in the journals about villages and the remnants of ancient villages that had been abandoned or destroyed because of the Indian Wars. And when I speak of the Indian Wars in this reference, I mean wars between tribes. And this is becoming an increasing theme in the journals at this particular juncture. There are a number of remnants of communities that have been decimated by intertribal warfare, in many cases long before any European settlement or even first contact is taking place. So there's a different dynamic in play, and in fact really the reality of it is that they are entering a new country. They are reaching Indian country at this point as they make their way into this particular region. Although they have yet to see any Indian settlements, they have encountered a couple of Indians making their way down the river in rafts and canoes, and they've had some interchange with those folks, but really they have not had any specific contact with any tribal force at all. Dorian joined the expedition this past week in the original journals. They met old Dorian, the patron for the Loisel Company, and they brought Dorian on board, and he had lived for 20 years with the Yankton Sioux up near the what is now Yankton, South Dakota, and they asked him if he would return with them to try to recruit some of the leaders of the Yankton Sioux to make a trip to Washington, D.C. to meet with Thomas Jefferson. So a lot's going on at this point. In fact, in the journals, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the ticks and mosquitoes are becoming prevalent characters in the story as well, and Lewis and Clark are recording the fact that they're becoming terrible bothersome around here. Just the other day we stopped past what is now Waverly, Missouri, and at that point, as they were passing that area, they were having terrible difficulty negotiating the swift currents there, and one of the things they did there was stop and make ropes and new oars and that sort of thing. So they are truly in an expeditionary mode 200 years ago at this point. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what's happened to the Discovery Expedition as well over the last week. Since we saw you last in Glasgow, and I think we can probably go to some of that footage, since we saw you last in Glasgow, we started making our way upriver, and we went from Glasgow to Brunswick, Missouri, and we have continued, and consistency is a great part of our story. We have consistently had rain. And here we are coming into Brunswick, Missouri, up the Grand River. Now, this is an interesting river. We had to negotiate a sunken bridge. You see where the boat's coming in there. There was a bridge sunk just below this, and it was kind of treacherous. And we want to remind people that the river is dangerous. And when you see us out here moving this wooden boat, understand that safety is a priority for us. And we're pulling into Brunswick here, the town of Brunswick, which is normally known for its pecan festival. It was very well qualified to have a festival, and they hosted a terrific Lewis and Clark event there. Just below where we docked, this is one of 6 very incredible, truly incredible boats here. This is a Pegasus-class hydrofoil missile boat, one of 6 that were built. Some gentlemen, the Meinhardt brothers from the Brunswick area, actually salvaged this boat. It's the only one that still has the working hydrofoils on it. The boat will actually operate now, and they brought it all the way from South Carolina around Florida through the Intercoastal Highway and up the Missouri River. And of course, we continue to parade and participate in local festivities, and there you see Seaman and the Corps of Discovery making their way down the street at one of the local fairs. And as I mentioned before, getting into Indian country, we're starting here to actually meet with enrolled members of American Indian tribes, and here we're fortunate enough to meet with some folks from the Ojibwa, Cherokee, and Lakota nations who were having a dance demonstration for the sake of the people here in this community as part of their celebration, and we're honored to have the Native American presence becoming a larger part of the story. And at a local fashion, one of the things that took place was a fashion show, and some of the men there are wearing the typical accoutrement and dress of the expedition in the time frame of 1803, 1806, particularly along the frontier. And you see everything there from the military uniforms to the French engagé and hunter scout attire being displayed there at one of the fashion demonstrations and dress parades in the town of Brunswick. After we left Brunswick, we made our way up to Miami, Missouri. Miami, Missouri, while not a terribly large community, there isn't really much there. And here we are at a church service before we leave Brunswick on the morning we left for Miami. And this was Sunday morning, and the folks there had an ecumenical service for us and for the town down at the riverfront. And it's an important thing to understand that while this story is about Lewis and Clark, the entire community is engaged in some activity, and it's really an opportunity for these small river towns to shine. And here are the boats underway to Miami, and this is an interesting area. This is the area where we discussed earlier that the Drouillard was out hunting, and he hears this gobbling snake, which is kind of curious. And this is at Waverly. They made oars at Waverly, and when I got to Waverly, of course, I made an oar in trying to keep the reenactment as pure as possible, or at least trying to reenact things we can. A street environment here in Waverly. The town came out in force, and they had a very good festival there, as well as Lewis and Clark. They were celebrating Founders Day and the founding of that community, which has a primary agricultural economy now. Apple orchards play a large part in that community, and we had a really enjoyable time with the folks there. They were tremendously hospitable and proved to be good hosts, and had a lot of fun with the folks here. The children engaged in some artwork as part of the Lewis and Clark celebration. They're painting a mural with Lewis and Clark theme. And here's one of the old churches. This is the old United Methodist Church in Waverly, Missouri. And a curiosity about this church is, while this is a new part of the church here, there's a plaque on the wall. The original church here is where General Shelby actually recruited his cavalry company during the war between the states. And right on the very porch here, he conducted his recruiting activities, and the store, as you can see, was used. The church was used to store arms and ammunition as well. So we're getting into another part of the story here, where the Civil War is actually once again becoming an important part of the story of this trail and this cultural corridor across America. Many of you may remember, as we came down the Ohio River last year, particularly in southern Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky, the story of the Civil War was a preeminent one. Obviously had a tremendous impact on the people along the way. And the same is true here. We're getting into another area that is particularly noted, and much of its character was shaped by the American Civil War. To that end, we're going to be joined today by two local experts in that area, historians and prominent members of the community. We're happy to have Paige Bellamy with us today. Paige, you are a prosecuting attorney, is that correct, for this county?
That's correct. I've been prosecutor now. I'm in my third term, and some other prosecutors that we've had in our past include Ike Skelton, who's currently a congressman serving in Washington, D.C. He's been there for a long time, so many of your viewers may know Ike Skelton, and he served as prosecutor. And participate and practice in the courthouse, which is probably the oldest courthouse still in use as a courthouse west of the Mississippi. The last 155 years we've used that as a courthouse.
Very good. And Ike Skelton, we actually were at Ike Skelton National Guard facility a few weeks ago, and Ike has also written a book about Shelby, which is in publication now as well. So he's great that you mentioned him, when we hope to have him as a guest at some point as we move through Missouri. We're also joined today by Byron Nicodemus. And Byron, thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you. We appreciate you coming, and hopefully can highlight some of the interesting history of this area and this city.
Well, let's start with that. We are, as I mentioned, in Lexington, Missouri, and I found myself over the last couple of days as we've been in the area, I have to keep catching myself from saying Lexington, Kentucky. I imagine that's probably not an unusual thing for people to do, but there's a reason that the town is named Lexington, Missouri, right?
Right. Actually, Lexington was settled by people from the Kentucky area and that general area, and it was named after Lexington, Kentucky, which I assume was named after Lexington, Massachusetts, which takes it back to the American Revolution.
Right. Well, there certainly is a connection, but there's much more of a Kentucky feel here than there is a Massachusetts feel throughout the community. The town was, and this is an important thing for our viewers to understand, is we make this move across the country. Oftentimes it's very chronological. As we came down the Ohio River last year, we went from town to town, and each town was sort of formed later and later and later until we got to the Mississippi River, and then we ran into towns that were much older than the ones we had passed because people had come from a different direction. The French had come up from New Orleans, and I think we're encountering that phenomena again here. We've been moving through communities that were formed in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, and now when we reach here, we reach a town that was founded in 1822 again. So we sort of jumped back in time, although we're continuing to move west. Tell us a little bit about how the town was formed and how that migration took place to make this town so far west and so far north, founded and established so early.
Well, of course, the first white settler settled in this area in 1815, which was Gillian Rube, and he was responsible for actually the formation of this area. It became a very key river port, and as in that day the migration so tied to the river and everything that Lexington became very key there. It was actually incorporated in 1822 in a section of town now called Old Town, and then was moved later in the 1820s down to the river because of the importance of the river port and everything. Also, this was an agricultural area. They raised hemp in this area and made a lot of rope and wagons and that type of thing for the western movement across the nation.
Now, you mentioned the hemp production here. Was that the first major agricultural crop that was grown in the area?
Yes, as far as I know, that was during the early 1800s a major crop that was grown in this area.
Okay, I was curious about the other day. I knew that they had continued to grow hemp for a long time in this area for rope production, and I wasn't sure if cotton had ever played a large part, of tobacco in this area.
I think there was some tobacco growing around this area, yes. Not much that I've ever heard about as far as cotton, but tobacco and hemp were two of the major crops in this area.
Now, you mentioned something about making the rope and wagons and those sorts of things for the further trek west. And, of course, this was the headquarters for Russell and Majors and, what's the third fellow's name?
Waddell,
right. Russell, Majors, and Waddell, who our viewers may be interested to know were the men who started and I guess funded essentially the establishment of the Pony Express.
Right. Yeah, actually, Russell and Waddell home is in Lexington. Their home still exists here as far as the buildings go. And they were big suppliers to the forts west of the Mississippi and everything. Majors also, who was headquartered in Independence, was a major supplier. And when a large government contract came up, they actually merged together and formed the Russell, Waddell and Majors, which later started the Pony Express and was headquartered originally in Lexington.
Now, it's interesting as you talk about sort of the military contracts, when we talk about the outfitting of these western expeditions and wagon trains and all of that sort of thing that took place here. One of the things that we always like to sort of put things in context about the then and now. Today, and I asked you about this when we were speaking the other afternoon, but the largest employer here in your community today, it's not too far removed from the same sort of thing. Could tell us a little bit about that company?
I assume you're talking about S&K Industry, right. And they are a supplier of wood products and gun stocks. And actually they manufacture gun stocks, I believe, for Remington and some of the other large manufacturers of rifles and so forth and so on. They also do business, I know, with Hallmark and some other large corporations for wood products.
Well, I found that interesting when you mentioned that they were making stocks for guns. We were often fascinated by how much things have changed in 200 years, and sometimes it's fascinating to think how little things have changed, that folks that are still engaged in something that we might think of as an older practice like that. Some of the other things that are of particular interest here in this community, and we've had a chance to see some of those things. Actually, I'm going to ask Jim if he'll start to look at some of if we can look at some of the footage from here in Lexington, and if you can, just maybe describe what we're taking a look at here. I think we're coming up to the 1830s log cabin.
Oh, okay. Well, this was an original log cabin that was down. In fact, there is some speculation on whether Rube, the original founder, was involved in this log cabin. It was originally down by what is called Highland Avenue and Commerce Street, down by the river where the ferries went across. I'm
going to ask Jim to go back to that real quickly. Jim, can you rewind and go back to that cabin one more time and hold on that? As we move through some of these things, I don't want to cut you short and go to another image and confuse our audience, so we're going to take a look real quickly at that again. And tell us a little bit about that again as we're talking.
Okay, in this house, or this log cabin, they were actually starting to tear down a house and found the log cabin underneath of it and saved the log cabin, moved it to its current location, and totally restored it back as close as what they could figure out it was in the 1830s.
Okay, and I think we've probably covered that now, Jim. And here we are. This is actually I don't know if we can hold on some of this, Jim. We're moving through it kind of quickly. We're sitting right now at the actually at the visitor center for the Lexington battlefield, and the sort of the focal point of this facility is this building that we see on the screen right now. We're looking at the back side of it, and but this is the Anderson House, and if you would start to explain to the folks here a little bit about this. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the battle and those things in a minute, but since we've got this already on the image, in fact, we've got a school bus going by, so I'm going to let the school bus pass for the audio for a moment. And Jim, if you would, could you rewind to the beginning of this section of with the Anderson House on it so the viewers can see that? Okay, we've got one more school bus, and why don't you go ahead if you can. We're here at the Lexington Battlefield Interpretive Center, and we are going to have Byron Nicodemus tell us a little bit more about the focal point of this facility, which is the Anderson House, and we'll take a look at this. And if Jim, if you can pause it as we move through it.
Okay, well, this is the Anderson House, and this is very interesting because it helps tie all this together from both the hemp production. Colonel Anderson moved here and actually was a hemp farmer, and built this house in 1850, and it overlooks the Missouri River, and he had warehouses and a rope factory down by the river, which is just down over the hill from this home. And then it became part of the Civil War. It served as a field hospital for both the Union and the Southern forces during the Civil War. So it ties all of Lexington's history together. It's also built, the brick in this house was all manufactured here in Lexington. And of course it's built in a Greek Revival style, which you will find throughout many of the homes that still exist here in Lexington.
Right, well, we'll talk a little bit, we'll mention that again. In fact, this is probably a good time, but the town of Lexington is filled. I think you have something like 120 antebellum homes. In fact, something like the largest number of antebellum homes in any city in America, I think, per capita, isn't it?
I'm not sure about any city in America. I do know that in the state of Missouri, we have the largest number of antebellum homes and buildings.
Well, it certainly is striking. I know as we drive along Route 24, it is striking how similar the plantation type homes are to what one would see in Kentucky or Tennessee or something like that. And you can see in the house here the bullet holes and things like that the house is still riddled with bullet holes from the battle.
Yeah, the house was actually, after the Civil War, was bought by a gentleman named Tilton Davis. And Mr. Davis was very good in that he did not repair anything that wasn't crucial to the living of the house type thing. So many of the bullet holes, even on the interior walls and stairs and everything, are still existing today that happened during the Battle of Lexington.
Okay, we're going to let this footage roll and actually talk about some of the other points of interest, and we'll come back. If we can stop on this one for just a moment, this is actually a column from the courthouse, and I'm going to turn to Paige Bellamy for just a moment. And this is when the Battle of Lexington took place here. This cannonball was lodged in the column of the courthouse. Is that correct?
Well, it's an interesting story. It actually the cannon fired towards the headquarters of Colonel Sterling Price, trying to strike his headquarters at the time. There were a number of different cannonballs that actually struck around or near that particular area. This cannonball struck the column, but it's believed it actually fell out at the time. It was later put back in and serves as a constant reminder of kind of the pain that this building suffered, similar to the pain that was in effect during the course of the Civil War. And it was in 1861 during the battle, and it has stayed now since that time, having been put back into the column to serve as a reminder.
Well, we're gonna segue briefly here from let that B-roll and take another look at the courthouse. Once we get the courthouse, a full shot of the courthouse, maybe we can stop there. And Mr. Bellamy is the prosecuting attorney for the county here. if we're going to let you talk a little bit about not only the courthouse and the importance of this courthouse in the community, but about some history of the county itself. And we mentioned earlier about the original journals were commenting on the ticks and mosquitoes of this area, and you had an interesting story to share, I think, and it'd be interesting to hear it again.
Well, originally the county wasn't called Lafayette County, it was called Lillard County. It was named after a prominent citizen. And Mr. Lillard, at some point in time, decided to move back to Kentucky, another connection to the Kentucky roots. And when he went back to Kentucky, he told prospective settlers about the problems with malaria fever in the area, and mosquitoes specifically. The folks here didn't take too kindly to that, and at some point in time decided, when Marquis de Lafayette visited St. Louis, he of course had assisted the country with the colonists fighting against England. They decided to vote and name the county Lafayette at that point in time. So there is some kind of symmetry in the sense that we had the mosquito problem in June 17th of 1804, and it played prominently in the history and the naming, actually, of the county somewhere down the line. Some
bad PR for the county. They wanted to get that mosquito albatross from around their neck, I guess.
And not give any plaudits to Mr. Lillard in any way. I don't think he was at that point that deserving. This particular courthouse was built in 1849. It finished in 1849. It cost about $13,000 to build at the time. Certainly construction now that's going on around the courthouse to further expand our court system is going to cost a little bit more than that.
Yeah, and were there any other things of particular interest about the county or history that you'd like to share with us? Because it is a unique thing. I mean, I think all of the men with the expedition have actually we've noticed a change. We feel like we're in a different place.
Well, it's interesting. You know, the town of Lexington, which is the county seat, was, I think, about the fourth largest city during the Civil War time. And it had about the same number of inhabitants as it has today, somewhere around 5,000. It's primarily an agrarian area, and it always has been and has its roots there, but we're connected fairly closely to the municipality of Kansas City, and so there is kind of a dichotomy in the sense that we've got the rural and the urban. As far as the county is concerned in the history, that courthouse, for instance, has witnessed a lot of things. It's witnessed Jesse James riding up and down Main Street. It has witnessed, obviously, the Civil War battle known as the Battle of Hemp Bales, because they rolled hemp bales during the battle to protect themselves. It's watched steamboats go up and down the river as the country grew. We've watched the westward expansion that Horace Greeley talked about, go west, young man. And this particular area being a river town, rivers just aren't obviously the main mode of travel anymore, and because of that, the nature of this town somewhat changed considerably. But
well, in fact, it might be said that really this was, in some ways, the first Western highways in many ways emanated from here.
Absolutely. The Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, all of those settlers came through here. We watched the migration of the Mormon movement came through this particular area. There is so much history that goes through here, beginning with all this classic Greek Revival architecture, and it's a wonderful place to have this real connection to this Civil War era, and it's so nice to have this connection to Lewis and Clark. It's great to have you all here today.
Well, thank you, and I'll tell you, just on a sort of modern note, why don't you tell, because we do try to get this into each of our broadcasts, why don't you tell someone who's watching, using Kansas City as a point of reference, what the quickest way to get here would be?
If you wanted to come here, if you're on basically the northern part of Kansas City or downtown, you can come I-70 or Highway 24. It's about 45 minutes from downtown Kansas City to Lexington. You would come I-70 to Route O, or you could come 24 Highway, which basically comes right to Lexington. There's also highways across the river that cross over here. You can take 210 Highway as well if you're coming from Kansas City. And all of them are pretty easy routes into the town.
Now, Mr. Nicodemus mentioned this to me yesterday, and I don't know if you could answer this question or who would, but when you talk about coming into the town, one of the things that was mentioned to me the other day was, I know you're building a new bridge here, and as many of the communities are along the way, their older bridges are starting to get to a point where they need to be replaced, building a new bridge here. But I think the story about this bridge, about the old bridge, about how it came to be, is a unique one. Are you familiar with that, or should...
I'm not as familiar with that. Mr. Nicodemus may know
okay.
something about the way that particular bridge came to be. I think it was about 1925, I think, is when the actual bridge was built, and it's certainly needing a change. Well,
and it's not alone. The Missouri River is covered, is crossed many places by bridges that are long overdue and being replaced. But Mr. Nicodemus, why don't you tell us a little bit about that bridge?
Okay, well, at that time, to get across the Missouri, all we had was pontoon bridges and ferry boats. And in the 1920s, the citizens of Lexington actually put together a campaign to raise the money to build the bridge. After building the bridge, then it was signed over to the state for maintenance and everything. But the citizens of Lexington actually pulled together and raised the money to erect the bridge, which for a historic bridge really is one of the longest span bridges, I think, in Missouri.
And it's a great story about a community coming together to make something like that happen and not relying necessarily on the government. And it's maybe a lesson to be learned there. At any rate, one of the things we really do want to spend a few moments on is where we are right now. We've alluded to it and we've talked all around it today, but that is the Battle of Lexington. And so we're sitting here at the historic site of the Battle of Lexington. In fact, I guess it's fair to say that where we're sitting right now, we would have been on the battlefield and probably fully engaged in the battle if we were sitting here.
We would have been right in the middle of the battle, actually. It would not have been a safe place to be sitting. Actually, yeah, of course, the Civil War actually started here before it actually started anywhere else, between the border wars between Kansas and Missouri. And when the war originally started in 1861, the Union quickly moved to secure Lexington because it was such a key river port and everything. At the same time, of course, the Southern forces in Missouri very strongly had Southern leanings. We had a lot of people that had moved here from the South, and so General Sterling Price, who came up through and recruited what was called the Missouri State Guard, which was still the people who leaned towards the Southern philosophy, came up and had Colonel Mulligan had 3,500 Union troops stationed here, and Sterling showed up and I think had about, and I don't remember the exact number, but about 18,000. And as Page commented, they used rolling hemp bales as armor to move up from the river and take over the site. And it was a 3-day battle. By today's standards, was not a whole lot of casualties, but at that point in history of just starting out of the Civil War, it was considered a major battle and a major victory for the Southern forces at that time, although that was before the Confederacy actually joined in.
Right, and I think that's something that I'd like to share with the viewing audience also is sort of the circumstances of what led to this situation. When Mulligan arrived here, one of the things that he did, as my understanding is, he took out nearly $1 million that was in the town bank and secured it so that it wouldn't be used to fund Southern opposition and rebellion in the South. And I mean that was the purpose. He wasn't raiding the bank for any sort of private gain necessarily. The money was secured, but but nonetheless it was done, and that caused a tremendous amount of, as my understanding, of angst in the local population, and probably a lot of people who were fence sitters were sort of thrown into the Southern camp, as it were, just as a reaction to that act of Northern aggression, actually.
Yeah, that's very true. That was one of the first things that the federal troops did do, and this was very much of a split area as far as, family against family and brother against brother, and it did bring out the Southern sympathy, and that was part of Price and his troops did come into town and recapture the money, actually, and returned it to the bank type.
And we saw the pictures earlier of the Anderson house. Real quickly, if you can, give us sort of an abbreviated scenario or synopsis of the battle, how the battle played out.
Well, number one, when the federal troops did, they just, how would you phrase it, commandeer the Anderson house. Anderson was, of course, was a known Southern sympathizer and everything, and many of the Southern sympathizers were exported or banned from the city or made to take an oath of allegiance to the thing. Well, he moved out of the house, and the Union took over the house and started using it as a hospital. When the Southern forces showed up, they also fired upon the Southern forces from the house type thing, even though it was a hospital. Therefore, it became subject, and back in those days you normally would not fire upon a hospital, but it became subject to the battle. And it was taken over by the Southern forces. The Union then reclaimed it again, and then the Southern forces, of course, took it back for the last time when the battle was over type thing.
And it's interesting to note as well, history records that 3 Southern combatants had surrendered when the Union retook the house, and they were executed. They were not given the rights of surrender. They actually were executed at the bottom of the stairway, is the way the story is recorded.
Yeah, according to how I've heard the story, there was 4 of them. They were up on the 2nd floor as they exited down the stairway with their hands up. There's a landing on the stairway with a door. 3 of them were shot as they went. The 4th one realized what was going on and exited through the door and jumped off the balcony type thing. He was the only survivor of the Southern forces that were recaptured there.
It is a sad story. I mean, and all stories of war are, but this is it's an important story for people to understand. It's so early in the war that we really see in this community and in this story a lot of the dynamics that are hallmarks of the Civil War played out right here in Lexington. And this battle in many ways was very much an example of what was yet to come for 3 more very, very bloody years in our nation's history. I want to thank you, Mr. I'm sorry, Byron, for being here today.
Thank you.
Byron, it's Nicodemus. We appreciate you being here. Paige Bellamy, we do appreciate you being here as well. Before we leave today, for all of our viewers out there, this is a very sad day for all of us and for me in particular. And I'm sorry to have to bring the following news to our viewing audience and to all of those of you who have followed us and have been organization as we have moved across the country. Yesterday morning at 6 a.m., the 16th of June 2004, I found Seaman, our Newfoundland dog, dead in Waverly, Missouri. The cause of his death is yet to be determined. He is undergoing an autopsy at the University of Missouri Veterinary Clinic, and as you can imagine, the men of the Corps have been very disturbed and upset by this. It was a great personal loss for me and my family, and we know that many of you have expressed your admiration and concern for the dog. We've been absolutely devastated by it, and there's little we can do to rectify the situation. The course of action that the Discovery Expedition will take is yet to be determined with regard to whether or not another dog will be joining us on this journey. I can tell you that this journey is probably more difficult on a dog today than it was 200 years ago. And we appreciate all of the kind words and comments and thoughtful things that have been done for the dog so far. His 1,500-mile journey from Elizabeth, Pennsylvania ended yesterday at Waverly, Missouri. And we would ask that if anyone cares to do anything to remember Seaman, we would invite you, if you care, to send something. We're going to we're planning on erecting a memorial, some sort of tribute to him at the boathouse in St. Charles, Missouri, at the Discovery Expedition boathouse there in St. Charles, Missouri on the riverfront. And if a memorial fund will be set aside for that marker there, and if anyone would care to participate in that, feel free to direct any correspondence or contributions or what have you to Bishop's Landing, the Discovery Expedition, Lewis and Clark Boathouse, Bishop's Landing, St. Charles, Missouri, and we'll put that information on the website for you. You can look at the website at lewisandclark.net and get that address information. But we wanted to end today's broadcast with a tribute to a member of the expedition who was as important as any of us. And while we proceed on, we hope that Seaman will rest in peace.